Hello, everyone. This is Frank Yiannas, host of Smarter Food Safety, where we ask the tough questions and seek real answers on some of the most important food safety issues of our day. Thank you for joining us. This week, we're going to have a fascinating discussion titled Food Safety Moonshot, Using AI to Strengthen Prevention. Just pause to think about this. What if machines could actually spot food safety patterns and trends, predict risks, and even implement controls before humans could even see them or react to them? Well, we're going to be exploring just that with someone who has probably done more work with AI on the food system at scale and in the actual real world than just about anyone else I know. Dr. Elliott Grant, formerly with X. It's a stealth moonshot unit owned by Google's parent company called Alphabet. Get ready for a fascinating and thought-provoking discussion on how AI has the potential to change the food safety prevention and detection paradigms. Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss this episode, his insights, and his predictions about the future. The Smarter Food Safety Podcast is sponsored by Ecolab, a trusted partner throughout my career. They're dedicated to protecting what's vital by advancing food safety, ensuring clean and safe environments, and enhancing water quality around the world. Well, hey, Elliot, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us on this podcast titled Smarter Food Safety. What a pleasure to have you on.
Hey, Frank, thanks for inviting me to the pod. Terrific to be talking to you again after so long.
Yeah, it's been a while, Elliot. Some people might know, but you and I have had the good fortune of crossing paths a few times over our careers. I remember, Elliot, when you visited me a long time ago when I was working at the world's largest retailer. And you were talking to me at that time, quite many years ago, about food traceability. And, people often say, Yiannas, you're one of the leaders in the area of food traceability. We did some work on food traceability with distributed ledger at Walmart. And then I went on to FDA to write a rule on it. But the reality, Elliot, is you've been working on traceability longer than I have.
Makes me feel old, Frank. But yes.
And then, Elliot, I don't know if you recall, when I went to federal service, I actually reached out to you because I had a great interest in trying to use this technology that people were talking about, AI, in the early days, really, really early days. And I don't know if you remember, the audience, I actually invited you to present to a large group in the foods program. Again, not to flatter you, some of your sharing of information shaped how we formed a new project there to use AI to predict which seafood shipments are coming in. So you've got a long history in working on this. And I like to say, Elliot, there are, in the stages of kind of adoption of new technologies, there are innovators, there are early adopters, there are late stage adopters. You have been an innovator in this space. I don't think I would do it justice to try to read your bio. So why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about your journey? You've been working on AI and food at scale for a while now. So maybe they'll be fascinated to learn more about your background.
Sure, happy to. And actually, I'm joining you from Cambridge here in England, from our 400-year-old cottage. So I think it's a lovely irony that we're talking about cutting-edge technology from a cottage that actually sort of predates America. Right. And this is what's great about Cambridge is these juxtapositions of technology and history. But yeah, let's talk about how I ended up here. My circuitous path actually started with a doctorate in engineering here from Cambridge University, and then a 5-year stint at McKinsey. And then I had this accidental pivot into the produce business in 2007. And of course, you may remember that was the spinach outbreak year. And it turned out the technology that my first company had developed for tracking semiconductors turned out to be really well suited for the traceability of food, which was a huge surprise. And that led to us creating a company called HarvestMark, which, as you said, was one of the pioneers of traceability back in 2007. And that pivot really hooked me on the food and produce industry. And after HarvestMark, I became the CEO of another company called Shopwell, which at the time, this was about 2014, was using primitive AI to recommend healthy food choices. Did that for a few years. And then in 2017, Google X, which is Google's secretive Moonshot factory, called me up and said they were starting a project on how AI could transform agriculture. At that time, Google could see this coming wave of AI. And on the call, I asked them for more details, like, okay, what would I be doing? And they said, well, we're a secret lab. It's a secret. And so I joined because that just sounded too interesting. Now, I think it's worth sort of casting the audience's mind back to those early days of AI in 2017, when a vision system couldn't reliably discriminate between a chihuahua and a blueberry muffin. That was where we were at in 2017. And then fast forward 7 years, what had started as a small project at Google X became an alphabet company called Mineral. And at Mineral, we pioneered a suite of foundational AI solutions for agriculture. So we've come a really long way together in AI, and I'm really excited to hear the work you did at FDA embrace that. And then last year, I came back here to Cambridge to take up a fellowship and research the impact that AI will have on the global food system. And here's the shameless plug. Hopefully, we'll have a book coming out end of this year, early next year, on the topic of AI and food, called Eating Tomorrow.
That's great. Yeah, very interested in that book. Thank you. So you come full circle back in the UK, back at Cambridge. Hopefully, Elliot, you haven't forgotten the Queen's English, and we haven't been a terrible influence on you for the time you spent in the US. But, Elliot, when this topic came up, it's early days for the Smarter Food Safety podcast. And when this topic first came up, I said, that's one that we have to have early. This is actually the 5th episode to tell you how important we think this topic is. But for me, it's who do we have to present or educate us on the topic? And again, immediately, the first name that came to my mind was you. So thank you again for extending your time to our listeners today. Elliot, we've been talking about AI for a couple of years now, but I think this past year in particular, for me personally, has been pivotal. It's been such a game changer. And, you can't turn on a news story. You can't pick up a newspaper. You can't see the business press. AI is everywhere, from investments to what do we think it's going to do to future jobs, to how it's impacting the economy. I traveled this week. I use Google Maps, AI in there. I do some shopping online. I know AI is being used there, medical appointments. It's just everywhere. And increasingly, we're seeing people talk about, well, what does it mean to food safety? And sometimes we have food safety professionals talking about that, and that's great. I think food safety professionals increasingly have to be what I call multidisciplinary, but I don't expect them to be AI experts. And that's why I wanted to have you as opposed to another food safety professional. But we know there are a lot of different subsets or types of AIs. So, right now the big fads are tools such as ChatGPT, which I use just about daily. But AI is so much more than ChatGPT. Maybe you could tell the viewers, as kind of a baseline here, maybe a Cambridge 101 primer on what are the different subsets of AI and how are they different?
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. And again, this may be obvious for some of the audience, which I apologize, but I think it's great to get a level set. I think about AI, at least right now, in four buckets or 4 flavors. First, and it's the one that you mentioned, is generative AI chatbots. And I would also put image generators in that group. And that's most of us are familiar with these tools like ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, Anthropic's Claude, and so on. This is really incredible tech. It's really easy to use. And it's built on a huge text corpus. So it's really sort of a conversational AI. So that's the first one, generative AI. The second one are called prediction AI models, or predictive AI. This is AI that can do things like, recognize chihuahuas or blueberries in images, transcribe speech to text, and do things like forecast yields. Now, you might experience this prediction AI in a photo app when you maybe search on someone's name and it pulls up images of that person. That's predictive AI. The third bucket, and this is much more recent, which we've heard a lot of news on recently, is called agentic AI. This is a different form of AI that can learn by doing and can take action in the real world. And examples that you may be familiar with would be a self-driving car, for example, right? It's learning from doing, it's experiencing the world, and it's taking that feedback and learning again. And the famous Go playing software that that DeepMind created called AlphaGo did this. We've heard a lot recently about agents going off and doing things on the internet. So those are the 3 buckets that are sort of increasingly more capable. But there's a 4th bucket, which I think it's important for the listeners to understand, and many of us have not experienced it yet. And that's domain-specific strong AI. And I'll give you an example. So AI can now write excellent software. So it's being used by the big tech companies to write code. In pharmaceutical, it can discover drugs. And we're now training it beyond text. So I mentioned the first bucket was all trained on text. we're now training AI beyond text to understand the real world and to really unpack domains like biology and genetics, which of course are super important to the food industry and food safety. So there's the 4 buckets: generative, predictive, agentic, and domain specific.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. I've actually learned something by this conversation. All right, so that's a good level set. There are different types of AI or subfields of AI. I thought another level set we could do just for the general audience, some people will be more advanced, is just this idea, Elliot, that, I've often been quoted as saying, better food safety begins and ends with better data. And then I started changing that to say better food safety begins and ends with better digitized data. And it's this idea or notion that, food safety data, which we still capture a lot of it, Elliot, as you know, on paper in this sector, whether it's on farms or in manufacturing sites or in retail establishments, there are a lot of records being kept on paper still to this day, believe it or not, 2026. And I've often play off of a Bill Gates statement that food safety data on a piece of paper is a dead end. There's not much you could do. If I'm checking, for example, at a retailer rotisserie cooking temperatures on paper, and I have 6,000 retail stores, I can't trend. I can't analyze that. I can't automate corrective actions. But food safety data in digital form is the beginning of meaningful action. I can trend and compare. I can prompt on corrective actions. So that's one idea. But now we're seeing a lot of digitalization happening and more records on data of food safety. But I still think there's this big, what I describe as a divide between food safety data and whether we have enough of it. And I know you have views on how much data do you need to actually do some of this work, and being able to convert it to information. This divide is pretty broad. And while I know we've had computers, I've been working with computers since the 80s, obviously, right? We've had computers and statistics and big data, so-called big data, for years now. My sense is, and I'd love to hear you describe how you think about it, is that AI is bridging this divide differently than the way we have in the past. And so as a baseline, on top of the types of AI there are, how should we think about how AI is going to help us with data?
Yeah. So, well, first off, you're exactly right in your thinking that data is the sine qua non of AI, and therefore AI for food safety, right? Without good quality, and I would say not just quality, but good diverse training data, the AI models are basically rubbish, right? We won't learn anything. But with good, thoughtful, diverse data, an AI model can potentially create new knowledge about a process. So not just create information, because we often say like, well, I have data but no information. We can go beyond that. We can have data that can create a new understanding about how a process is working. We can discover hidden patterns in complicated data streams that no human could have seen, and potentially transform the way we do things, because we're so limited as humans in, as you said, capturing data on paper or the limited ability to understand data. It's interesting. It's a paradox because humans are actually very efficient at interpreting data. And in many ways, AI models are very inefficient at interpreting data. And this seems somewhat counterintuitive. But I'll give you this example. You can teach a toddler what a banana is by just showing it to them one time, right? Say this is a banana, and that toddler will learn it. But a computer would need thousands and thousands of images of a banana before it even understands what it is. So they learn very, very differently. On the other hand, though, AI algorithms are incredibly good at what humans are not good at, and that is integrating huge multi-dimensional data sets. Us humans, we max out at about 3 dimensions, right? Beyond 3-dimensional space, our heads start to explode. But an AI model looking at that banana is thinking in 16 million dimensional space, right? It's just, we can't even understand how AI is doing this, and it makes my head hurt. The point is, and I think this is the point you're making, used wisely, AI will help us transform the data we've got, make more value out of the data we're collecting, and then ultimately augment human tasks, make jobs more efficient, replace boring, repetitive, or subjective tasks. And I think this is where it gets interesting, completely transform other tasks. So change the way we think about food safety. So I often think about this as a framework of augment A, replace R, and transform T, the art of AI, if you like.
Yeah, the transform in particular is very interested. and your comment that it can help us learn new information, I think is very intriguing in the area of food safety, because so many times we're trying to get data, we're trying to analyze data, I think to your point, in kind of one-dimensional, two-dimensional form, without really completely understanding other data sources or attributes that are affecting food safety. And this concept of One Health for the food safety community out there will completely resonate with them. Is like, we're looking at this one-dimensionally, whether leafy greens get contaminated in a field, but there's a lot of other things we need to consider. And we really don't understand why these events happen, why they happen certain times a year. And analyzing all of this data might teach us something new. That might help us to learn something new that we didn't expect or know. Fascinating. So let's pivot now to, how do you see companies using AI today? You've done a lot of work. I think, if I were to speculate, a lot of people have worked with AI or machine learning, an early version of it in limited capacity. You've done this at scale, at Alphabet. Analyzing large sums of data in the food and ag sector. I know that. So I wanted to pivot and just kind of do a level set that, companies now these days, I'm serving as a consultant now since I've left the agency. And lately, the past year in particular, a lot of companies have said, how should we be using AI to improve food safety? And my first thought is not a real novel one. Elliot, as I always say, well, it's not about chasing AI, this new shiny coin that everybody's talking about, but what is the use case? And in our field, I think of them as, what is the public health challenge that we're trying to solve? And then I'm trying to stay up to date and know a little bit about the different subtypes or fields of AI. So are they good fits for that use case? And my initial reaction, we want to hear from you, is that you use one term already, prediction. What a wonderful use case. I mean, anyone in the field of risk management, certainly food safety professionals, are trying to predict which process, which ingredient, what product might go wrong or be contaminated. I'll give you a simple example. As I heard you speak, I thought of, well, geez, during my tenure at FDA, we regulated, and they still do, tens of thousands of different food establishments, whether they're farms, food processing facilities, indirectly through a model food code, tens of thousands of retail establishments. But for the establishments that FDA regulates and oversees, Elliot, I don't know if you know, we rank them into two categories: high risk and non-high risk. So you think 80% of the food system, wide diversity, dairy producers, fresh produce of all sorts, packaged foods, 80% of the grocery store, and all those foods are categorized or ranked into two categories: high risk and non-high risk. If it's high risk, we'd inspect them, or we try to at least once every 3 years. If it's non-high risk, every 5 years. What do you think about that in terms of a form of prediction?
Well, I was laughing because it does seem a little bit of a blunt instrument, right? That there's some bright line between high risk and low risk. And I think it's a good start, what we call a binary classifier. It's either one or the other. But the reality is that AI should actually be multidimensional, right? It should explain, it should have a sort of a continuum of risk, right? Why is this one high risk? Under what, maybe it's the time of the year. Maybe it's that we have switched sourcing from, Yuma to California, and that's why it's higher risk now. So I think where AI is taking us as a community is going from these very simplistic, this, not that, reject, accept modalities to a much deeper understanding of why. So I think it's a lovely example of how it's currently being used, but also an opportunity to do it much more nuanced.
Yeah. I mean, prediction is so important at the agency. Based on, your conversation with us, we went off and did a pilot on using machine learning, an early version, obviously a subset of AI, to do a seafood predict. Most Americans don't realize 94% of all seafood they consume comes from abroad. We were using statistical analysis, determining sampling plans, but while the agency is now stepping up and talking a lot about AI, we actually led a pilot back in 2020 that showed we could dramatically increase our chances of finding volatile seafood shipments by leveraging machine learning. And to your point, Elliot, turn it from this static process where we created these rules once a year, once every 2 years, to a more dynamic process, which is the sampling occurs when the machine is telling us it's time to sample. the seafood and where it came from. So I think prediction is a good one. The other things I've seen is people using it, obviously in other ways, monitoring, coupled with image technology to monitor food products, determine if they're a foreign object or certainly the quality of the food. I've seen some starting to develop digital assistants to have their equivalent of a digital microbiologist or a digital chemist. We've seen it. There are programs and companies that sell training modules where AI can help you develop training. But Elliot, you've worked with a lot of companies. What do you think are, knowing that the challenge is trying to produce, I would say, safe, nutritious, sustainable, and affordable food of high quality? What do you see as some of the best current use cases for the audience to think about?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my expertise, so I'm going to be speculative here. But the ones you just mentioned are, I think, really good examples of augmentation. In other words, we're currently doing a task. Can we do it better with AI? And I think that's a great line to pursue. But where my head immediately goes is, what are the applications in food safety or food quality that would be simply impractical to be done by a human? And they may not be that, dramatic, but they, in terms of the complexity, but they could be dramatic in impact. Think of a couple of examples. I know in field grown produce how important hand washing is, for example. How do you ensure that pickers and harvesters are compliant with hand washing station usage? Well, a very simple $50 camera on a hand washing station, just looking down or monitoring, anonymized people, could easily detect whether or not someone was washing their hands properly. You'd never hire a human to do that, but that'd be a terrific use of AI. Or in a food packaging facility, monitoring hairnets or unsafe practices. Again, you're not going to have a human looking at a camera feed for 24 hours a day, but you absolutely could have an AI do that. So I think those ideas of what could I do that wouldn't be practical are a good start. The other one, and we've talked about this a little bit just in a previous conversation, was sources of data. What if you had an electronic nose that was, whether it's in a meat packing plant or a salad washing facility, was continuously monitoring the airflow for pathogens or volatiles? And again, I don't know if that's possible, but think of something that just you can't do today because the signal is just too small or it's lost in the noise. That's ideally suited to AI. AI is very good at pulling out small signals from the noise. And I think it could open up a whole new stream of monitoring. And then the fourth idea that sort of comes to me, which is sort of really out there, and it was triggered by what you said about the import detection of seafood. How about, instead of having these sort of static HACCP rules, which say, okay, I've analyzed my process and I have these rules and I go and do the measurement, that the HACCP rules become completely dynamic. And we have a HACCP AI agent that's dynamically adjusting the testing regime based on what's actually happening in real time. Again, this would be so impractical to do if we had a paper-based system. But if we handed it to an AI agent and said, actually, right now we should be doubling our testing regime over here, and we could afford to reduce it over there, could deploy limited resources more efficiently. So hopefully that sort of gives an idea of what sort of pops into my head when you say, how could AI help with food safety?
That's great. And I know you've worked with AI in food, and there might be some that you can disclose and you can't, but any use cases that you did for sustainability or quality reasons that you think are particularly interesting? When you look back of all the work you did, what are some of the, maybe one or two of the proudest achievements?
So so let's start with food quality. It's such an interesting use case. Today, across the food supply chain, we have experts looking at produce. I might use produce as an example, but it's not just produce, looking for defects or mold or contaminants. And it's highly skilled and it's really hard work. And you could only do a small percentage of the shipments because it takes a lot of time. So most of that job is ideally suited to visual inspection. And one of the things we did do was train AI models to detect 20 different defects on one kind of produce. And we demonstrated that compared to human experts, not only was it at least as good as the best inspector, but it was far more consistent. And I think this is what often is missed when we look at human performance. Humans of these subjective tests are very inconsistent. Right? You give 5 people the same object to score, and you're going to get 5 different results. sort of just inevitable. Whereas what you get with an AI system is extreme consistency. And that's very helpful when you're looking for long-term trends. The other thing that the AI allowed us to do was to move quality inspection into places where it wasn't feasible before. I could move it upstream into the field. I could move it downstream into the distribution center. I could move it to the front of store. So I think what we learned was by performing at least as well as a human, actually you could even afford to be not quite as good as a human, but I could do it in 10 times more places for a fraction of the cost. So that was one sort of aha we had in food quality, and it worked really, really well. And you mentioned sustainability, which is a really big topic we could spend a lot of time on. But one of
Sure.
the things that we were able to do was monitor behaviors from satellite imagery or remote sensing. Now, I'm struggling to think how this is relevant for food safety, but I'll tell you what we could do because
Yeah.
I think it might trigger some ideas in the audience. We were able to look at satellite imagery over time series and could tell the management practices a farmer was using. Obviously, what crop did they plant? That's easy. That's somewhat trivial. Although interestingly, leafy greens, we could tell the difference between spinach and romaine. We could even tell the
Amazing.
difference between organic and conventional from space.
Amazing.
Yeah, that was, I mean, again, there's like no way a human could see that, but the AI can detect that. So
Amazing.
you can do the crop type, you could do the cropping practices. So we could see crop rotation, we could see whether there was a cover crop planted or a field was left fallow. And we could even tell whether a field was plowed, was tilled. So for food, from a sustainability point of view, that's incredibly useful to be able to say at very large scale, as you said, this is scale. I could do the whole country. At scale, what's happening at every single farm? And from that, we could determine whether a particular field was using certain sustainability practices. And actually, as we're talking, I'm remembering the conversation we had when you were at the agency was, wouldn't it be interesting if you could have a unique ID for every field that was growing romaine lettuce or carrots
Yes.
or spinach, which I believe doesn't exist today because it's just impractical. Totally. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say it here on the podcast, but I think that's totally doable.
Yeah. That's so cool. And as I hear you think about satellite imagery and specifically produce, I think about when you're growing produce, one of the things we're often concerned about, not all farms and fields have, fences around them, but we're really concerned about animal intrusion. And, the spinach outbreak was attributed to animal intrusion. You can't monitor that. Your example of you can't hire a human to be out there 24/7 of all parts of a field, but maybe you create a system where you can monitor if there was intrusion, where there was, and somehow take some type of mitigation.
Let's riff on that for a sec, because I like this idea. I think there's a couple from satellite remote sensing. You could certainly say, is this field within a proximity of a concentrated feedlot or a chicken farm? I mean, chickens are probably not getting out of the farm, but what's a risk factor for this field based on its proximity? Or I could say, what's its proximity to a waterway that might overflow? Again, totally doable from remote sensing. And then you come down to the more field level, the ground level. I can't detect a pig from space because the resolution is too low. But you could imagine having either a roving camera or a camera on a pole just continually monitoring for intrusion.
It's fascinating.
Is it cost effective? I don't know. But
Right.
it's certainly technically possible.
Yeah. So interesting to think about. And even as I think about the farm example is, we've had some flooding events in certain parts of the world, and we wonder, well, how far did the flood go, and how do you determine the flood? You could get visual representation of whether the flooding reached certain areas or certain crops. Okay, pretty cool. So some real use cases, and I think the challenge, Elliot, will be for the listeners to determine, okay, well, how might I apply some of these technologies to my own personal use case in my company and my sphere of responsibility in my production plant? But you've given us some good examples. Now, I think I've heard others say that when it comes to AI, we're still at day one, and it's still early, and it feels like we've seen so much evolution and progress in the past few years alone. It's past couple of years, it seems really exponential in my mind. We believe this slope remains, on a positive exponential kind of mission. I love to kind of look into the crystal ball. If you were to look into the crystal ball, knowing what you know about AI, had worked on it at scale, one of the largest places, and you try to project where you think things are going. What do you think is going to happen with AI specifically in the future?
Hmm. I I always hesitate on this question because, to your point, it is changing exponentially. And if history tells us anything, humans are extremely bad at predicting exponentials, right? We're just constantly surprised by it. There's the famous, story of the king and the chessboard and the rice grains, if you know that one. But so it's very risky to make a prediction in an exponentially changing market. But what the heck? Let's have a go. And knowing that I'm going to be wrong about the timing and the capabilities. On the one hand, I think the most important thing to say is I'm very optimistic. There's a lot of negativity around AI, and I think that's well placed for lots of reasons, and I'm not going to talk about that. But as it pertains to food safety and food quality and human health, I'm actually very optimistic of the value of this tool. I think the gains could be very, very significant, and the costs can be very sensible, right? This is not an expensive technology to deploy now. So at a macro level, I think this is great. I hope more companies are embracing it and exploring. But what I've been thinking a lot about is, and this is what the book is actually about, is what are the unintended consequences of implementing AI, of putting an AI into a system which is so complicated, the global food system. So I want to opine for a minute on some things I've been thinking about of what happens when we inject AI into a complex system like food. Something that we already know is these AI models become quote unquote, black boxes. What that means is we can't understand how they make decisions. And they can't even explain to us how they make decisions because they're thinking this high dimensional space. And frankly, we're too stupid to understand it. And that's only going to get worse or better, depending on your point of view, that the AI models have become more and more capable and our ability to understand them is going to increasingly be great. And if you your hat on as a regulator, right, this is a problem, right? How do I know that AI tool is predictive and it's behaving in a way that I want? So I think the FDA and other regulatory agencies are going to have their jobs cut out to determine, as these tools get implemented, how do we regulate them? How do we help a customer, a food company, decide if this tool is actually good or bad? Because it's no longer just following a set of written rules. It's not deterministic. So that's number one. I think risk of non-interpretability is quite real. And it's a conundrum because, the simple answer is, well, the model has to be predictable. Well, now you're going to be limiting yourself to very, very trivial models, right? So we would give up the potential for something very powerful. So that's number one. Number two, well, let's go back to the data point you made. In something as complicated as food safety and recalls, where they're fortunately very rare events, no company has a lot of data about food safety recalls or contamination events. Even the big companies, right? They're collecting data. They might capture an event. It's going to be a rare event, and so we end up with what I call the inverse tragedy of the commons. That unless we pool all these data together, we're all going to be worse off. Right? There's just not enough information being collected to train a model to become very smart. AI models need diversity. They need edge cases. If you showed a model a salad packing line and nothing ever went wrong, it's definitely not going to learn anything about food safety. So number two, the problem number two is how do we incentivize companies to share this very sensitive data in such a way that we can train a model that sees the whole picture? I think that's again, it's sort of a regulatory problem.
Yeah.
And then the third one, which I think, again, is like trying to think into the future, is the recall system itself. Right? It's a system that you ran and I knew well when I was at HarvestMark. It's sort of still old school, right? Something happens, it gets detected, it hits a certain threshold, and we try to communicate this all to consumers or for retailers. And it's sort of 1970s, if you like, technology. At some point, though, I think, in the future, I will have an AI shopping agent that I've outsourced my shopping decisions to, and that agent will be scanning the alerts, and it will determine if that liverwurst that I bought and I have in the fridge is subject to a recall. And it will alert me. There's like, you know what? Don't eat that thing. Toss it away. Now, until I have some kind of home robot that can open the fridge and throw it away, I'm still the weak link in that loop. But I do think that we are heading into a future with more automation, like the example you gave of Google Maps. People are going to outsource their decision making to these AI agents, and those agents can actually do a lot of the heavy lifting for us around things like food safety. So again, I think that one makes me optimistic, but it sort of is, the ball is in the regulatory court of how do we make sure that the systems are all plugged in to these information portals.
Those are great comments. The first thing I think about is, if these things are going to be automating, making decisions, predicting risks, maybe automating some type of corrective action that we think is going to make us safer, so they can do it with high precision and sometimes more consistently than humans. That sounds really fascinating. I love your comment about, hey, we need to consider unintended consequences. But I do get a little concerned, and I think any regulators tuning in, we need to start thinking about that right now because this future is coming quickly, which is we want to know how to regulate it. And my sense is that regulators will inhibit or prevent some of these new technologies from being used and adopted. And so I don't like the idea of thinking of a world where the regulators are preventing or prohibiting new tools to be adopted at speed that could create a safer and smarter food system. So we're going to have to think about that because if the black box is making decisions that we don't completely understand, it's hard for the regulator to say that's okay. And I
Exactly.
even get that a little bit, Elliot, from the companies. You start working with companies and they say, well, how do we know that the machine is right? And so there's this whole human change management process that is as big or maybe bigger than it is the advancement of the technology itself. And
Yep.
so let's spend
Yeah,
some time.
100%. I mean, that example you gave at the end of like, how do we know it's right? Sometimes I would turn around and it's a little bit cute to say, well, how do you know the expert is right? Right? We're relying on human experts who have, through their years of experience, accumulated tacit knowledge. And many human experts couldn't tell you how they knew something. They would say, it just felt right. I just had a feeling, I had a sense for that. And we may be like, good enough for me, right? This person's an expert. I think we're going to end up at a point where we're going to attribute the similar kind of the benefit of the doubt to these AI models. But there has to be some way that we can give this model a stamp of approval and say this one is actually no good. And to your point, I think the regulators and the tech providers and the companies should be sitting in a room right now to say, how do we do this together? It's all in our self-interests for us to not be on either side, on the opposite sides of a table.
The other comment you made, which is a really important one, and I hope listeners really take this to heart and are inspired to take action because we've been talking about this for a while. I don't think we've made the progress that we should have made. With the future that you're describing, it's like, listen, folks, we need to start making progress on this. And this is data sharing. When I was at the agency, we published a blueprint called the New Era of Smarter Food Safety. During my tenure there, we were really focused on trying to cast a vision for the next 10 years and saying, what is it that we have to do to change? We know these emerging technologies, the way we produce food is going to change rapidly. We'll probably see more changes over the next 10 years than we did in the past 30. And our old regulatory frameworks aren't up to it. So we were trying to encourage data sharing. And I like to say, in the 20th century, I was there at the late 20th century as a food safety professional, and we thought collaboration was, hey, we'll call different companies together. Food safety is non-competitive. We'll sit around a room and we'll talk best practices. And I don't know about you, that feels so outdated for the 21st century. And to me, it's collaboration in the 21st century is data sharing.
Mhm.
The same type of food? Is there a way we can create some type of anonymous data trust where we share data? We allow tools like AI to get smarter together and we all benefit from that. But there's some big hurdles there. There's the legal hurdles, lawyers being concerned about sharing data. There's the big hurdle of, well, if we share data, we don't want to share it with the regulators because the regulators might use it to harm us. But we're going to have to spend some time on data sharing. I don't know if you've seen any examples of where data sharing has worked or any tips on kind of overcoming some of these hurdles.
Yeah, and I have, and I don't want to dismiss these concerns. They're very legitimate. Whether it's human health or business proprietary information, people are understandably reluctant to share sensitive data. So let's look at the human health domain. Actually, there's some very interesting work happening here where, what could be more sensitive than people's personal health histories? But if I want to train a model to do, say, develop a new drug and if the efficacy, I kind of need access to this human health data. And what I think there's a project actually in the UK with the NHS, National Health Service, where they've successfully de-identified this data, anonymized it, and certified that it is anonymized. That's very hard to do. But then make it available to researchers so they can sort of probe this data set I think you mentioned it briefly there. There's going to be a new role for data brokers, for data administrators who can protect the security but give access to legitimate partners without giving away something private. So I think that's a really good structure where whether it's an FDA organization or a nonprofit or a university, steps in and says, we'll be the data broker, because we're a trusted independent party. That's one. The other is, and this is more of a technical answer, you can do something called confidential compute. So I won't get too technical, but basically you put your data in encrypted form into a server, and everyone puts all their data into this encrypted server, and the model runs effectively inside the encrypted server, and it spits out an answer. But nobody ever gets to see the data that went in. Again, that's a technical solution to this problem of de-identifying data. And I actually think there might be a third way, and I haven't seen anyone do this yet, but I imagine they're working on it, which is, imagine I'm a food processor and you're the FDA. I have an agent, an AI agent acting on my behalf, and the FDA has an AI agent acting on their behalf, and the agents talk to each other. And they are well constrained in what they're allowed to do, what they can disclose, and they effectively do agent-to-agent negotiations. And what triggered me to think of this is when you said the old way was we'd pick up the phone and we'd have meetings, we'd go to conferences. But that's very, it's sort of very infrequent, right? It's very low bandwidth. Replace that with AI agents that are just talking to each other 24/7 at high speed. But they're all playing by my each stakeholder has its own rules, and this agent-to-agent domain I think is quite interesting. As long as we can control the agents, they don't go off and come up with something on their own. It might solve the problem of disclosure and misuse. Right? If I'm worried about the FDA is going to misuse this, well, maybe the FDA agent has a very strict set of rules. It says it can never use this information against the person providing it. So I think there's a suite of options to solve this if we're creative about it.
Yes, so many interesting ideas. We could spend an hour going off on these, Elliot, because this concept of an FDA agent, the reality is you could build some regulatory consistency. One of the things the private sector wants is certainty and consistency. And today they have human agents. And it depends on which human agent they get on the phone. They might get, if they talk to 5 different human agents, they might get 5 different answers. And so building rules for consistency, I see this could be an interesting thing. Your comment was real provocative, which we get the questions, why should I trust the machine is like, well, why do you trust the human subject matter expert? Fair. I hadn't thought about it kind of the flip side, but that's fair. Maybe just 2 more, because like I said, we can go on for hours and unfortunately we can't take up that much of your time. I do want to just think of the future a little bit more. And another one that I just fundamentally think about is what we're experiencing right now. When it comes to doing what we call food safety risk assessments, Elliot, generally I describe that as a very rear view mirror type of exercise. You look at your food that you're producing, the production methods that you're using, and you look at the historical literature to say, has this ever been a problem in the past? And based on history, you might identify these are hazards that we might expect. These are risks that we might expect. But we've seen a couple of outbreaks here recently and recalls that they weren't what people would say reasonably foreseeable hazards, because we're looking in the rear view mirror instead of out of the front show window. We're not imagining what could go wrong. We're only basing it on what has gone wrong in the past. And, hindsight's always 20/20. If you start looking, well, were there some early hints of this potentially being an issue in the literature, but people weren't piecing it together? I think there might be an application here where leveraging AI, we might do more forward-looking risk assessments as opposed to rear-view looking risk assessments.
I know, it's brilliant. Actually, and of course, driving from the rear-view mirror is going to end very badly. I mean, you've seen the movie Minority Report, right, with the precogs?
Yes.
What made me think, as you were talking, is like, what if you could anticipate a food safety event before it actually happened? Now, good luck going and saying to a food processor, I need to shut you down. Nothing's happened yet, but it will. Right? So, but I think where you're heading here is a mind shift of the philosophy of food safety, rather than fighting last year's war, rather than sort of saying, well, this happened before therefore I have a pattern to match. I'm actually looking at the fundamentals and saying, we can see maybe an increase in background noise of E. coli, or we can see a sort of a loss of temperature control in this supply chain. We're going to anticipate proactively this is risky. And maybe that leads to increased testing before actually a recall. Or maybe it says, look, you've crossed the threshold. We need to sort of withhold this batch for now. It would be, as you know, it'd be a complete change in the paradigm shift. But it may be better, right? We may catch things earlier. We'd have more but smaller recalls, and hopefully, if it worked, we'd have fewer big ones.
Yeah. Yeah, and so even if it told you we're concerned, maybe it's not shutting a facility down, but it's take some additional interventions because we're concerned about it. Or consider this risk that you don't think is a risk because we're seeing some data evolving in certain parts or certain labs of the world that says it might be a risk in your product.
Well, and then, when I set up the 4 buckets at the beginning, bucket number 4 was what we call now world models, right? A world model of biology, a world model of genetics. And these are very aspirational. They can't do it today. But I can imagine a future, if we go on that exponential journey together, where there's a deep enough understanding of the biology of E. coli and pathogens and bacteria that you can accurately predict, hey, this is going to happen because my biology digital twin says it will happen. And I can predict things before they happen in terms of growth rate. Yeah. Again, we're not there yet. Nobody send me any email that it will be done.
But it's conceivable with, if you look where the trajectory of where we're heading, all of this is conceivable. Hey, at the last one in terms of the crystal ball gazing here, because I do think it's important to try to not only prepare or guess, but knowing that these tools exist, I think even better yet, Elliot, let's try to shape these types of solutions. Let's try to create these types of future possibilities, as opposed to just trying to predict them. That's really the purpose of this conversation is let's go out and do these things if they're possible. The last one is, I think I sincerely believe that maybe 15 or 20 years from now, we're going to look back as in my profession, food safety, and we're going to think those guys and gals were pretty crazy the way they were working, because you're going to have new tools that work very differently. And what I mean is by this, and want to get your reaction, the audience should know that we don't plan questions in advance. This is an unscripted conversation. So Elliot has no idea what I'm going to ask. But Elliot, if you think about it, fundamentally, what we're doing what we did at FDA, what we do in regulatory arenas and in food safety communities in the private sector is we're regulating 2 things, and they're physical assets, right? They're establishments that produce food production facilities, maybe a farm. They're physical attributes that produce food. And there's a physical attribute of the food that's being produced. Okay? And the way we manage food safety is we write rules about how these establishments should operate. We write rules, standards, GMPs, HACCP plans. And we write specifications for the physical asset of the food itself. The food should be free of E. coli. The food should meet X, factor on quality. And then for the establishments, you heard the regulatory model. We come and inspect them once every 5 years or once every 3 years. And we say, they're in compliance. And for the foods, it's even worse than that. It's some real rare, maybe sampling to see if it meets the standard of identity, if it's free of contamination. That seems really, really primitive in light of the technologies that we're talking about now. How does that change?
Gosh, there's sort of one world model, which let's call it the Big Brother model, for want of a better term, which is extreme oversight, right? The FDA says if you're going to be a certified food facility, you need to install this monitoring equipment, which we, the FDA, have the rights to see. Now, I don't see that happening anytime soon in the US, but that ability to have global visibility and continuous monitoring, it's like what you do in meat processing plants, right? You have somebody there all the time from the USDA. We don't do that in the FDA. It's just not practical. Why not, right? What if that wasn't a person, but it was a data feed? So I think one model of the world is extreme oversight, where to be entitled to sell to Americans, you have to agree to do this. Another model is sort of more, they call it distributed oversight, where the data doesn't flow back to the FDA, but the FDA has put, let's go back to your idea earlier, the idea we talked about, the FDA agent. There's an AI agent sitting in your facility, inside your firewall, and it's running its AI models, analyzing your facilities and your practices, and it's looking at the camera feeds. The data is not going out to the FDA, but only if you hit a trigger, it says, "Oh, wait a minute, I see something, and I'm going to alert you first. And if you don't take action, then I'm going to call the FDA." That seems a lot less. That seems a lot more benign, right? I think people could probably go for that. So I think this, again, we'll go back to this paradigm shift idea. Why don't we break away from the model of like a human-centric, paper-based, very episodic inspection regime, which is always going to slam the door after the horse has left, to a future which is proactive, continuous monitoring, light touch, and everybody should be happy because the horse doesn't never get out of the barn.
Yeah.
I think that's a future I can imagine that happening.
Love that. Yeah. And I think it's monitoring data. I don't think it's to the first extreme that you described, but that's obviously would be possible. And I don't think it happens in a free society like the United States. But I like the signals, alerts, something is happening. Maybe regulator, you should have a conversation with the company or make a visit, or even maybe the compliance mechanisms we use are different as opposed to it always being the in-person inspector arriving at your door. There might be other ways to provide compliance oversight. And, the simple analogies I was hearing you speak, Elliot, is this idea of how I used to change my oil. I used to change the oil in my car every 3,000 miles or every 4 months, and I had a sticker on my windshield to say, "It's time to change your oil, Yiannas." I don't change my oil that way anymore. Why? Because my car has sensors and data, and the car tells me, "Yiannas, it's time to change your oil." And so, FDA, it's time to do an inspection here. Waiting 4 more years is not a good idea. Or maybe in some cases,
Yeah,
you
you
don't
don't
have
need to
to.
change it.
They're managing their processes so well. That's very fascinating discussion and entertaining on where we're going. Let's bring this back to earth. I did title this a little bit theatrically, Food Safety Moonshot, in light of you came from the Moonshot, the stealth Moonshot division at Alphabet. So you were there. We just had a spaceship launch that's going to go past the moon. But let's bring it back to earth, because one of the things we've always said on this podcast is that, it's great to be thinking about the future. Better yet, it's greater if we're trying to create a safer future. It's great to have very interesting guests such as yourself, Elliot. You've been probably in the trenches and done this at scale more than anybody else I know. But then some of the listeners will say, "Well, Yiannas, that's great. You got Elliot who worked at Google, and, you worked at one of the world's largest companies, and you worked at the FDA. I'm not working at these big brands. I'm working at a very important place. We're producing food products. I can't do those things. I can't do what Google does or what Walmart or FDA does." And I don't want them to just say this was an intellectually satisfying conversation. I want them to say, "What can I do?" So I know you will have some practical tips for the listeners today. For those that aren't working at these big brands, but everybody's producing food and trying to keep it safer, what's your advice? What should they be doing today? How can they get started in this AI revolution?
Yeah. Before I will get to that, before I get to that, I do want to prod at the Moonshot title, because I think Moonshot is somewhat overused. And remember what the original Moonshot was like 300,000 people, the entire US government, hundreds of millions of dollars. And we literally put a man on the moon, and it was incredibly risky. I actually hope that food safety is not a moonshot, right? I hope it isn't that hard. And actually, I'm optimistic that this is not a moonshot we're talking about. At most, it's an earth shot, right? This is very doable. And I don't want to be pretending this should be considered outrageously hard. So
Fair.
With that criticism of your title choice, I apologize. Let's get to what could people do literally right now. Well, you said it earlier, Frank, like data is the key to this whole thing working. Without good training data and good measurement data, you're not even looking in the rearview mirror. You're just completely blind. So I'll leave. I think there's 3 things I want to leave the listeners with. The first one is something I always say when I give talks. I end with this is, I think it's an old Chinese proverb, which I've abused. The best time to start collecting data for food safety and quality is 10 years ago. And the second best time is tomorrow, right? You can never go back in time and collect data. So it's gotten very cheap to collect and store data. I would recommend that listeners start thinking about what data should we be collecting. And it's very doable. That's number one. The second one is AI is intimidating, right? It's how do you get started? It seems expensive, it seems complicated, it seems unsafe. Many people are worried about using the tools. So how do you get started in an organization getting familiar with AI? My recommendation is do little projects in low-risk applications, like use the tools that are readily available and easy to use, like Claude. And I'm not on commission. I just think it's a great tool. Do little projects. Imagine, for example, you've got someone who wants to check that the Best Buy dates that have been printed on the package are readable. They haven't been blurred or the ink's not run out. Do a Claude project to build a vision system that can check the dates are printed right. Nothing terrible would happen if it doesn't work, something no worse than it was beforehand. But it's a great way, I think, to help the organization learn the strengths and the weaknesses of AI systems and build some in-house knowledge. So I think doing low risk, low cost, little AI projects is a good idea. And then the third thing, which you mentioned as well earlier, this is actually not a technology problem. At the end of the day, this is a change management problem for industry and for organizations. So you won't change the organization's culture by implementing an AI tool. We have to think holistically about how do I train my people to be able to be comfortable using these tools? How do I get a culture of data quality and questioning the AI in case it's wrong? So, even though I'm an engineer and I think everything is a technology problem, I'm very cognizant actually this we're talking about is a culture change and a human problem as much as it is tech and data. So there you go. Those are my three things for you.
Those are great tips and pieces of advice. Start collecting data, collect more of it. And if you're collecting data on paper, let's start collecting it in digital form. So food safety data in digital form. I love the next piece of advice, which is let's get started right now. And I love that you said, go prove something, figure out what's a pain point for you. A little bit now, and not only from this podcast, but from what you've read and heard of how you might apply what's a good application of AI, and do proof of concept and start small. But one of the things I see, Elliot, people they want to boil the ocean. They want to do the whole thing. And I've most recently given companies advice. It's like, no, you're trying to do too much. Just start small. I like that advice. And then the other part is that it's the soft stuff and the hard stuff, right? The hard stuff is the technology, and we don't understand that. And people increasingly, but and the technology initiatives I worked at, both in the federal government and then at Walmart, sometimes it was the people part of it that was harder. It was how do you get people on a distributed ledger platform when there's they're decentralized, they have different motivations. They start figuring out kind of the motivation and the human side of it. So those are three great pieces of advice. I hope that this talk inspires people to take action. I hope that you found it as fascinating and as interesting as I did. And there's things that I've thought about, Elliot, that I simply hadn't thought about. So I'm going to have to go back and spend some more time on it. And hopefully, we figure out how to take action. Listen, thank you for taking time out of your busy day. You're at Cambridge University, such a prestigious university. And you took time out of your research and teaching and writing to spend time with us. Thank you for all the work that you've done. We're all fascinated, but you've been innovating in this space long before any of us actually rolled up our sleeves and dabbled with it. And I think there's a difference between an innovator and an early adopter. I want the listeners to be early adopters or mid-stage adopters, but thanks for being an innovator in this space. Thank you for teaching. Thank you for always making time for people that have an interest. And thank you for writing. We're all going to be very interested in reading your book. Give me a hint. When do you think it's going to be out?
Well, I'm due to send it to the publisher at the end of June, and here, there's a book about AI. The irony is they'll say it'll take 8 months to print it. So I don't know how that's going to happen.
We need to get an AI agent.
I think we need to speed that little process up. So maybe the end of the year, early next year. I'll let you know.
Well, we'll be looking forward to seeing that. I can guarantee you we're going to consume every page of it. Thanks a lot, Elliot. Keep up the great work. Stay safe, and we look forward to hearing from some of the work you're going to do over the next few years. All right, that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion as much as I did and found it useful and quite fascinating. The next episode is already in queue, and it's yet again another good one. I promise you, it's one you won't want to miss. If you haven't already, please subscribe right now on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, and continue to join us for these important conversations. Together, We're going to learn from one another and help create a safer, smarter food system that benefits food producers, regulators, but most importantly, all of our bosses, the consumer. Stay tuned. We'll talk soon. And until then, be safe.